Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Jason Hanasik. Jason is a filmmaker, artist, curator, and journalist. His work has appeared at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, in the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, in the academic journal Critical Military Studies, at various international film festivals, and more. Today we discuss the themes in his work of making visible what is hidden and telling stories of people who aren't normally heard. We also talk about his exploration of masculinity in the military and the importance of making space for new definitions of what it is to be a man despite sexual identity. Lastly, we briefly touch on the importance of amplifying the queer perspective in journalism and media today. To learn more about Jason and to see his work, visit jasonhanasik.com. That's Jason, Hanasik.com. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Jason, through some of the work that I've seen of yours, one of the main things I see is that you are a storyteller, a visual storyteller primarily, but you also do a little bit of writing. So, Jason, one of the things I know about you and your work is that you are a visual storyteller, and I wonder if you could start by telling us the story of how you first got interested in photography.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, my parents said that they would help me get a car, like buy a very, very used car. But the condition was that I had to have a job and obviously pay, half of it. And so my best friend helped me get a job at the local Taco Bell. And I worked at the local Taco Bell for maybe like 2 months and did not have a really good interaction with my manager. And one day left the job, and my parents freaked out because I broke the contract that we had made. And so I had to quickly find another job, and I found another job at a 1-hour photo studio, and actually a gay guy that was running the studio portion of the photography section. And I was processing the photographs or the rolls of film. And I was literally processing his pictures that he was making. And I thought to myself, I think I can do this better. Like, I'm interested in this. And so I saved up my money. I had paid the loan back on the car, and I bought a little SLR camera, and I started making pictures of my sister. And I saw that her sense of self, she loved the way that she looked in the pictures. And I saw that I was giving her the gift of maybe seeing herself through someone else's eyes, basically. And I thought, oh, this is a really powerful thing to be able to do, to light somebody in a way in which they look beautiful and they feel beautiful. And it literally started out with that, that simple of a thing of a 1-hour photo job. And I needed to pay back this loan, and then finding my way into it via seeing just the power of seeing different sides of yourself through this medium.
I'm curious to know if the photos that you took of your sister affected her in any way, seeing herself through your eyes.
I mean, she liked doing it, and we did it a lot. So I'm assuming that it was a positive thing. My sister was a lesbian, and she was constantly playing with gender, in outside of the space of the photograph. And, she would do everything she would literally present as a guy some days, and then she'd present as high femme other days. And most of the time she was being forced by my family to present more in high femme. So I think the space of the photograph also helped her explore those other sides.
Yeah. Okay. And one of the themes I see in your work is this idea of exposing something that is hidden or sharing something that is invisible. And I see that in your photo book, I Slowly Watched Him Disappear. And I mean, even just the wording that you use to title some of these things, I hear it, I Slowly Watched Him Disappear, or Hidden Worlds of Homeless Women. And then also in How to Make a Pearl, which is not so obvious in the title, but is basically a short film about a man who lives in the dark, literally lives in the dark because he has to. So I'm curious if this is something that was conscious for you or unconscious in terms of these themes of invisibility or something that is hidden or not known?
At first they weren't. And I think even now when I'm getting the bite or the bug to pursue a project, it's not something that I'm like, okay, where's the hidden thing? However, I can remember I went to undergrad in New York and I moved back to Virginia because that's where I was making all of my photographs at the time. And the first gay family that I was a part of, the matriarch of the family said, you constantly make things that are hiding in plain sight. And that's the gift that you're giving us, is because you show us these things that either we're not talking about or we literally can't see. And it kind of comes from, I think the first time I got an awareness about this was in my junior year of undergrad. I had gone home the previous summer, and photographed my family extensively just because I didn't know what else to make pictures of. And that was the thing that I was most curious about. And I came back and I was asked to basically cover the walls for the first critique. And I put up this one photograph that's kind of followed me now the rest of my career, which is a photograph of my parents called Jeff and Jackie Hanasik. And in the photograph, my mom is taking up the majority of the visual space, and my dad is kind of draped over the banister. She's looking directly at the camera. You can't really tell whether or not he's looking at her or he's kind of in a daydream moment. And that picture, my mom is 6 foot or 6'1", and my dad's 5'11". And my mom is definitely a much stronger personality in the house than my father was. My father was the one that I would go to with my emotional concerns, and he really modeled that behavior, whereas my mom was significantly more stoic. These are all flips of what the normative ideas of how, families are constructed, at least at that point in time in the cultural conversation. And so I brought that back, and that's totally normal for me because that's what I grew up with. And everybody else in the room was kind of shocked at this photograph, and shocked not like it blew their hair back, but they were pulling out all of these other things that I just had not been seeing because that's not where my lens, personal lens was looking or thinking about. And so I definitely see the through line of the hiddenness, but it's also just, these are the things that I'm paying attention to constantly. So, with the hidden lives of homeless women, I was doing a short documentary up here in the Bay. And I was really just interested in the people that were on my block because I live in the Tenderloin, Tender Knob-ish area of San Francisco. And there's a wide variety of individuals that find themselves on my block. And I ended up interviewing a woman, and she told me one of the most depressing stories I think I had ever heard. And also it surprised myself that I had never thought that this could be a situation, in which she said that she was basically selling her body to a group of men so that she could sleep at night, because they would then and the transaction was that they would protect her from other men trying to rape her while she was sleeping at night because she was homeless. And so when I went down to the LA Times to work on their VR team, at the moment to be their VR team, I was like, there's been all of this homeless reporting, but let's really focus on what it's like to be a woman living, being homeless, because I think that the questions that they're having to navigate are totally different than some of the questions that men are having to navigate, just because we're all vulnerable in different ways.
Yeah. And I also imagine that part of it comes from just being a queer person, because we grew up having to look for things that are sort of hidden in plain sight in a way, just to be able to find each other. Right. So I can see how just that skill of growing up in that way and looking for things in that way has affected your general perspective on the world and allows you to see the things that most of us are not normally looking for or looking at.
I mean, yes, I think that's one of our gifts, actually. And I think it's a gift that we get from one of the sadder parts of the reality at the same time, which is that, we, as the late performance critic or theorist Jose Esteban Munoz would say, we're disidentifying constantly, right, with normative culture. We're having to look at it and go, oh, I really like Aladdin, but I'm also not Princess Jasmine. But in my fantasy of the way the Aladdin thing goes out, I get to be Princess Jasmine and I get to be Aladdin at the same time. Mm-hmm. At least that's my take on.
Yeah. And I can also see how in your work, you're almost doing like two layers of the not being seen when you're doing work or producing work around these identities or groups of people that are not normally looked at, like homeless women or farmers, and then also looking at people within that group who are queer. So even within their own group, they're probably not fully seen. Because I know you did a piece around gay farmers too, right?
Yeah, that was a commission. So there was a guy that actually lives in my building who runs an organization that's focused specifically on the intersection of queerness and agricultural production in the United States. And he needed a marketing video. And I was like, oh, I'm so interested in what's that conversation? Because you're right, it's this double obscuring, or not double obscuring, but two moments where the person is sort of not seen in popular culture.
Yeah, because we know that farmers exist, but in agriculture in the United States, we just go to the grocery store and everything's there. We don't even think about the farmers.
Right, exactly.
I'm also curious, it seems that you seem to have a bit of an interest in the image of military or soldiers, because I've seen a few pieces and I'm wondering if there's a personal interest there, or, some part of your own history that has relationship to the military or anything like that.
Sure. So I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and adjacent, it's a part of the larger 7 cities of Hampton Roads. And one of those cities is Norfolk, Virginia. And it has the largest naval base in the world. And then on top of this, I grew up a mile away from Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network headquarters. And so the two things that organized the culture where I'm from, or the three things, are tourism from Virginia Beach, the religious right with CBN, and the military with the naval base. And when right before moving to San Francisco in 2007, one of my childhood friends died during his first tour in Afghanistan. And I watched that friend group of mostly all straight men except for myself. They really did not have the emotional tools to process this grief, because they're also they were all Marines, and they were trying to hold the image of what the Marine should look like. And, it's one of the pinnacles of masculinity in American culture. And I was like, oh, I have a lot more open to me as a queer man, just because the breadth of public performance looks very different, or we have access to it. And I was like, this would be an interesting project to basically look at what this grief process looks like, and to work with these men, not in a therapeutic perspective, but to really get in and get curious about where those things butt up against, like where the expectation of the Marine and the human, the male, intersect, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But I'm also aware that it's not just those identities, but you are also really challenging what it means to be male, particularly in those settings.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just share for the listeners, especially because your work is visual, we can't really describe it. If you could, or I can't show it to them, but if you could describe a little bit about some of these pieces that you've worked on, particularly with farmers or men in the military, and how you have shifted the gaze that we put upon them and the way that we see masculinity differently. Sure.
I'm going to get into that via an anecdote, because I think it will set it up in a really productive way. So all growing up, I had a best friend who was part of this friend group where we lost one of our friends during his first tour. He identifies as a heterosexual. It was a very, very close friendship. I was getting the phone calls when he was deployed, the satellite phone calls in the middle of the night when he was scared. It was deeply emotional, very scary, because I could hear the mortar fire in the background. I was like, oh my God, my best friend died. Like, the reality of that set in. And so when I started this project, the first military project I worked on, which was He Opened Up Somewhere Along the Eastern Shore, I brought it into one of my end of the year critiques. I was making this in service of my Master of Fine Arts. And I had a critic who was on the panel say to me, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, but basically he was like, well, you just want to have sex with all of these men. And I was extremely frustrated, because I realized that he was limiting the quality and type of relationships that I could have with other men, and that he was reducing it just to a sexual relationship. And I became so frustrated, because I had this, at that point, decade-long friendship that was deeply intimate and deeply emotional. And it almost tried to obscure that and reduce it to just being this carnal interest. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it was much more, there were many more shades of gray. And so when I was invited down to the main subjects, the guy that became the main subject, if he opened up somewhere along the Eastern Shore, he was like, why are you making all of these pictures? And it was at this point that I had just made the photograph Stephen in a Bed of Flowers, which is a Marine with his head kind of tilted down. He's laying on the ground. He's got his hand up kind of by his chin. If I remember correctly, it's been almost a decade since I made this photograph. And he's lying in a bed of yellow flowers, and he's in his uniform. And we had been making photographs, and I shot this photograph in between other things that had been posed. He was literally just resting, waiting for me to tell him, kind of what else to do. And he got up from that. We went inside and he asks me, why are you doing this project? And I had this moment, an ethical moment, where I was like, well, I'm terrified to tell him the real reasons I'm doing this project, which is, I want to try to open up what it means to be a man, what it means to be a military man. I got scared because I was fearful that he would revoke basically the access, that he would no longer want to be part of it because, for whatever reasons, homophobia, whatnot, or fear that, he would be caught up in something that would reveal the inability to kind of maintain this lock stock military sensibility of presentation. And his response was the exact opposite. He said, yeah, we're stuck. Like, this is a really scary thing because you are taught to be Superman. That's how you can go and do what you do and be kind of fearless. But on the back end, you don't really get the tools to integrate the experiences that you've had, especially when someone dies, especially when someone close to you dies, and you realize that your own mortality and that to go back, you could be the next body, basically, casket. And so he opens up his archive of photographs and videos. And it's in those photographs and videos. I was like, may I have these? And he said, yes. And so I take them. And in the project, you get these photographs that I'm making. And then you get these photographs that are presented at the same scale with the same sensibility. So, if I made a photograph and it was printed 20 by 24 inches, I would make his photograph 20 by 24 inches. And it was Stephen's photograph of a man carrying 2 bottles of piss, right? Because there was a photograph of one of the guys that he was deployed with in the green zone in Iraq, and he was carrying 2 bottles of piss, probably out of where he was sleeping, to go and throw them away. And it was as highly charged and eroticized, and I put those in a lot of air quotes, as a photograph that I would make. But the gaze was, or the person making it was a heterosexually identified Marine. And I basically am trying to bust open this idea that gay men are only interested in the erotic gaze, that we're only interested in other men in this limited sense or this limited fashion, because I think it shuts down our possibilities for connecting both with straight men and with other members of our own community. Because I want really full relationships with men that are not tied to the bedroom. I also want those relationships. Those are wonderful. And I think that one of the things that we see where this plays out is in visual culture, right? So when I go to a lot of LGBT specific events that are photography related, I'm constantly presented with that gaze. And I just think that there's a spectrum here. And so I was trying to introduce that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I definitely see that in all of those images. And I really appreciate you challenging that. And I was glad that you shared the story about the critique that you got in school, because what I hear there is, here's someone who you think is supposed to be looking at something a little bit with more of an open mind, who is trying to maintain what's happening in terms of the way that we think we're supposed to be viewing masculinity in this country. And he, by that comment, he's trying to shut it down.
Right. I have a film coming out in the fall, and it's about the thing that you think it's about is racial violence. And then tucked away right at the end of the second act is this incredible critique of American militarism that the subject of the film makes, because he's also a veteran. And you don't see that coming. And it's a kind of Trojan horse in a certain way, because you click the button thinking you're going to watch a film that's about racial violence. And then that story gets turned into another way in which a body can be made to feel disposable, when they thought their best interests were being, taken into consideration. I should flesh that out. The racial violence is that the act is perpetrated by a stepfather. So it's a son that the stepfather, enacted some violence on them. And I guess the reason I'm saying all of this is because militarism, I've noticed, is one of those things that you just Americans don't really want to talk about it. Like it's a thing where when you start poking holes in it, and there's a lot of holes to be poked into, I notice that there's like a vibration. It gets really uncomfortable in the room in a certain way because our own imperialism it's like a blind spot.
Well, I imagine that militarism, just like masculinity, is something that we want to keep it the way that it is. And so by talking about it or exploring it, then it brings up the possibility for holes to be poked into it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So this sort of leads us into something else that I know that you wanted to talk about, which was the importance of queer people in journalism and the newsroom. And I think that, just again, this example of the way that you got that critique, it's important for people who have a different perspective, whether or not they're queer, but particularly queer people and the queer perspective is important to have in journalism. I wonder if there's more that you want to say about that.
I think that when we're writing headlines, when headlines are being written by journalists, or the certain way that, like certain turns of phrases that are used in a news story, I think they have long-lasting effects. So when the American Psychological Association or, any association that has already debunked anything from gay conversion therapy down to the efficacy of gay parents, on children, when I see a headline, which just because a statesperson has said they don't agree with that, that opinion is put out into the public sphere in a headline situation, that has real ramifications towards, lives that are being lived. And I just wonder, no matter what population, be it queer people or any population that doesn't have as much power in the public conversation, so to speak, we need all of those positions or perspectives represented in the newsroom so that we can really push back and say, that headline actually could cause somebody to kill themselves. Like, you putting that out there has real ramifications. I saw something on Twitter maybe like 3 weeks ago that a reporter from BuzzFeed had retweeted and was really angry. And I totally agreed with him, where CNN had a lower third and it had something to do with LGBT, people. And then it was like Rick Santorum being imaged, and he was the face for, whether or not we basically deserve to be in public. I mean, I don't remember the exact context of what it was talking about. And I just looked at that and I was like, CNN, like, you're not a neutral party here. You're making the choice, to put this specific type of vitriolic language back into the public conversation. And I just feel like, what would it be like to have more representation so that this type of conversation isn't just repeated over and over again? And somebody thinks, like, how does this affect us? I don't know if I'm being super clear.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important topic. I mean, basically what we're talking about is having a voice. Yeah. And also, people who have voices need to be more careful about what they are amplifying as well.
This fall, I'm going to release a film that is about a guy who was set on fire by his white stepfather. He's mixed race. His father's African-American, his mother's white. The film looks at the trauma this man has experienced, but the thing that I'm probably, and I don't want to discount that, but the thing that I'm most interested in the film in many ways is the image of fatherhood that he presents, because he now has 2 boys of his own. He survived the fire and he has 2 boys of his own. And at the end of the film, or towards the end of the film, there's a scene in which the 2 boys, it's the nighttime ritual, they're being bathed. We're watching this happen. And what we're hearing in voiceover is the father talking about why he writes a set of lunch notes to his boys almost like every week. And in the notes, he's telling these boys all the things that he loves about them. And these boys are children of color, and they live in Portland, Oregon, which has then historically had some race issues. And one of the things he said was, I want to make sure these boys have a sense of themselves and to love themselves before someone else tells them what their story about themselves should be. And when I think about the way reporting on LGBT populations, on immigrants, on Muslims, like, all of the reporting that's done on populations that don't have as much representation in a newsroom to push back and say, that's actually problematic language to be using to describe an entire population of people. And it leads to a sense of self that we know is not right. So, I mean, how many times do we see LGBT kids committing suicide? Like, it's constantly happening. And I'm looking at headlines sometimes going like, if I was a kid sitting without the opportunity to really have a conversation with other LGBT people because they're living in a rural area and they're disconnected, or they're living in a metro area and they feel disconnected, this is a headline that's like not going to serve them. And not that that's the job of the journalist, but the job of the journalist is to look and go like, am I giving voice to a population, to a perspective that is niche, but appears to have a lot of power, or more importantly, which is more disturbing, is going to create a click. Mm-hmm. Like, are we selling out a population just because it's going to get you to click because it's more bombastic or whatnot? And I think that's a question that we should be asking.
And that's what journalism is all about, asking questions, supposedly.
Supposedly. I hope so.
Yeah. So starting to wind down a little bit, Jason, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Yeah, I have two people. So both of them I'm really interested in intergenerational friendships. I had an adopted gay granddad who lived here in San Francisco. He died in 2015. His name was Jerry Rosenstein. And among other things that he did during his life was he was a Holocaust survivor. And one of the things that he taught me during our long friendship was he would witness at various events as being a Holocaust survivor, but he also refused that to be his only identity, that he wanted to be something more than just a Holocaust survivor. He wanted to be a patron of the arts and multiple other aspects of his own identity. And it's something that sits in the back of my head that I'm constantly thinking about, of how I can acknowledge all the parts of my life without just being locked into one specific thing, because I think that shuts down the fullness of what one could be. And the other person would be Daniel Goldstein. He's an artist. He was one of the guys that's featured, or one of the people, that's featured in the documentary We Were Here. And I guess the focus on both of them is literally, I just get a sense of perspective of someone that's, being a queer person in culture longer than I have, and helps me not to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And, it's really forged a path of what a life could look like, and helps me think through how I want to make my life, how I want my life to look.
So you have the documentary, A Childhood on Fire, coming out. How can people see that or find out about it?
Yeah, so that film will hit the festival circuit in the fall. And then it was commissioned by The Guardian, the UK newspaper. They have a documentaries division. And so we haven't set a date yet for when that will go online, but it'll be online probably in, I would say, early winter at the earliest of 2019. Best way to keep up with me is, my website is, I update it every so often when there's a project, but I have a newsletter that goes out that you can sign up for my website or Instagram, and my handle's just @JasonHanasik.
And your website is?
www.jasonhanasik.com.
Okay, great. Well, I will have those in the show notes for people to find. And thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Do you feel lost or stuck? Or are you alone on your healing journey? If you're seeking guidance or support, I'm here to help. I offer online coaching and counseling for queer spiritual folks from all over. Schedule your free consultation with me now by going to queerhealingjourneys.com. I look forward to supporting you on your path. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.